So I'm doing my thesis on specifically anorexia and women of color. I'm deconstructing two prominent myths that anorexia only affects a certain population of people, white, middle-class, teenage girls. The second myth is that the core cause of anorexia is appearance-based, and that a lot of girls are, basically killing themselves just to look a certain way. I'm critiquing both of these myths. First, I critique the psychological literature and the biomedical literature, and then I actually critique the feminist literature. Yeah, and I argue for an intersectional approach to, talking about and researching anorexia. I also argue that eating disorders start off as healthy coping mechanisms to different types of oppression and trauma. Yeah, so almost all literature on eating disorders come from the psychological or biomedical field. A lot of people aren't even aware that feminists do research on health issues too. Usually in women's studies, we'll critique kind of like the main camp that whatever the main ideology that whatever we're studying comes from, and then we look at what the feminists have to say about it. I really don't agree with some of the things that the feminists have to say about it. I actually come from, psychology. That was my undergrad degree. That's how I learned about, eating disorders. It wasn't until last year when I started taking these gender and women's grad courses that I realized that some of the ways that the psych literature deals with mental health in general is kind of problematic. They look at everything from like an individual pathology perspective. They don't really think about like broader social issues as being correlated to health. I look a little bit at the DSM diagnostic criteria for anorexia. I just call for, just a completely different definition of how to diagnose people with anorexia. It's a little bit of a problem that people have to fit all of these specific criteria in order to be able to get help. I think eating disorders are much more of a spectrum. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have disordered eating and need to get some assistance for that if you don't fit these specific criteria. Almost everyone that's been researched and in research studies looking at anorexia is of a certain social group. University women, mostly white, middle class background. Almost all of the research that we even have about anorexia comes from a very specific population of people. Yeah, so for treatment, I talk a little bit about access to health insurance broadly. Often people with anorexia who do have health insurance, the insurance doesn't cover the treatment. And if they do cover the treatment, the insurance company will base it off of BMI. You will be cured if you reach a certain number. There's actually research on BMI being a racist system and just flawed in general. I'm working within the framework that I'm critiquing, even for all of the reported rates, statistics, definitions of anorexia. I'm constantly going back and saying, well, these numbers are actually biased. So once a patient reaches a BMI in the normal weight range, which is 18.5, the company will consider the patient has reached a place of wellness. They don't consider a lot of other aspects of treatment that I think are important after a patient reaches this normal weight range again. First, basing coverage on BMI is dangerous because it only affects a portion of individuals with eating disorders. I'm going to have a section at the end about what is an intersectional approach to dealing with eating disorders and anorexia in general. I think I will vie for a new definition. In past papers I've researched eating disorders more broadly, and often when you talk about eating and healthy eating and communities of color, there's a lot of dialogue about the obesity problem in Black communities and how if Black women are diagnosed with an eating disorder, it's usually a binge eating disorder. So I think there are a lot of interesting questions surrounding just healthy eating and pressures to look certain ways that are complicated by race, class, gender. Some feminists don't even think that binge eating disorder should be considered an eating disorder. Sometimes overweight isn't necessarily unhealthy. One article that I draw a lot of, my most basic ideas about this paper from calls for the end of the word disorder and instead to call it eating problems. She's one of the first authors I've read that claims that eating problems are actually stem from a natural coping mechanism to abuse and oppression. It's safe to say that some people do start to follow an unhealthy pattern of eating. Disorder just springs, individual pathology into mind. That it's all one individual's, psychology and social location. If you say eating problem and frame it in a different way, then people might be able to start thinking of eating problems in a broader perspective. Patterns and eating behaviors that become so severe that your daily functioning in life and your overall well-being and quality of life really suffers. And not necessarily about, I'm trying to debunk this myth that it's all about appearance and trying to fit a certain beauty ideal. There's no argument that there's so much pressure to attain a certain beauty ideal in the United States. We are affected by all the images we see in advertising and in the media. It's dangerous to put all the blame on the media. It not only turns women into cultural dupes, that they have no autonomy of their own or power to be able to, fight against these images. You're not looking at a lot of the other oppressions that might be leading to certain disordered eating behavior. And also, I don't think it's fair to think that women are so duped by trying to look this certain way that they will literally, starve themselves and kill themselves. There's every once in a while when I'm doing an overview of the psych research, I'll come across an article that says that, women who have been victims of abuse have, there's a higher correlation to eating disorders and that they may be a natural coping mechanism. So almost all psychological researchers now, I think, of the ideology as multifactorial. They look at biological factors, psychological, or individual level factors, genetic factors, and social factors. So I do a little bit about what the psychological research has to say about each of these things, and then I kind of more broadly critique the research methodology. A lot of psychological models include sociocultural factors, and this might actually come from more of a social constructionism aspect. A lot of feminist theorists have been vocal about the influence of media images on eating disorders, and that's the crux of a lot of their arguments. And some feminist theorists also posit that it's a type of backlash. Women gaining power in the workforce and economically is a threat to patriarchy. One author says that men are drawn to women of childish body and mind because it's less disturbing to their power. So they look at gender, which I think is good, but they exclude, intersectional approaches and issues of race and class. There's really not that much research on other possible causes or influences, but there are a couple authors that have this same basic standpoint. Eating disorders start out as natural coping mechanisms to different types of oppression, and I like thinking I like the way that this author states natural coping mechanisms. And there's an interesting part of this article that I've been alluding to where they mention that women are almost always in charge of all of the cooking in the kitchen, and they deal with all of the food in the house. Then they also feel this immense pressure to not be able to partake in any of the food. They don't have time to actually enjoy the food. There's an interesting aspect of just thinking of certain pressures that women feel. It literally forces them to not be able to eat as much of the food. There are a couple studies that suggest that stress from poverty or upward economic mobility can lead to disordered eating or eating problems. I don't think that a lot of people would think of any kind of connection between poverty and anorexia, but I think there's a lot there. There are several studies, like I mentioned, even in the psychological literature, about connections between childhood abuse and anorexia. One author just also talks about just broadly that eating problems come as a coping mechanism to sexism, racism, homophobia. I want more people to have more access to all types of healthcare, knowledge of nutrition, wellness. Even though I critique a lot of the psychological literature, it's really important to have access to counseling. Even for people that can't afford health insurance, if you are back at a healthy BMI, you'll no longer be covered. I think just a different definition of who is, who's cured and doesn't need help anymore. Eating disorders in general have some of the highest relapse rates, and I think people struggle throughout their whole lives. Yeah, that we need to get rid of patriarchy, dismantle patriarchy, and that's what I would argue for theoretically, but practically that's not realistic, and that won't help individuals suffering from eating disorders in the present. So, but I do think that's the answer. But I think that first understanding that all health, how much of a connection there is between your social location, and you can't look at health on just individual on like an individual and biological level, but that health is also influenced by your social location. And you could look at a lot of different aspects of health and how your privilege can really dictate how healthy you're going to be and how likely you are to develop different diseases throughout your life. Patriarchy is a social system in which the male is the primary authority figure central to social organization, and the central roles of political leadership, moral authority, and control of property. And we do live in a patriarchy and a patriarchal society, so we need to dismantle it. A society where masculinity is rewarded. I think I'll stay with that, the most basic definition that I think. Because 90%, almost 90% of people that have disordered eating are women, and I think that there's definitely gendered aspects to eating disorders. That being said, I think it's equally as important in general to understand that there's 10 million people in America that are affected by eating disorders, and 1 million of them are men. So statistically, that's obviously so many more women, but 1 million men is so much. I think I also struggle with that, and when I first took abnormal psychology, I thought of that question a lot. I think that practically speaking, it's important, but again, theoretically, I think it does a lot of damage. So I think there are a lot of problems with it, but then this is something that I run into a lot in general, like the tension between what I believe theoretically and then what can actually be done realistically and practically. So, because I mean, if people don't fit certain criteria, then they're not going to get any help at all. I mean, I guess practically just to be able to, once a patient tells the doctor, oh, I've been diagnosed with clinical depression, the doctor will have, I think, a broad idea of the patient's needs, being able to put a label on certain things so that you can continue with research. But that's more on the individual level. There's a little bit of a danger in the idea that these behaviors start as natural coping mechanisms because you don't want to positively reinforce something that could be, really detrimental to your health. Mm-hmm. But I think it can also be a comfort to, the patient, because I think there's a lot of guilt in the way that anorexia is framed right now, and continuing on with the way that most people think about it. I think the way that most people learn about anorexia and think about anorexia doesn't leave a lot of room for empathy with the victim, because it puts almost all of the blame on the victim. Like, why did you do this in the first place, and can't you see that you're a completely, you're so skinny and you don't need to lose any more weight, etc. You hear a lot of blaming, I think. We need to dismantle the patriarchy.